Today, we are continuing with our monthly webinars to raise awareness about the type of restoration activities that we support with the donations and memberships we receive from gaming companies. I think we now have close to 60 actors, gaming companies who are supporting our selected portfolio of restoration projects. So today we are going to talk about these efforts of restoring biodiversity in forests. And the term that is used around these activities is creating the old growth forests of the future. So the main problem that we are facing that leads to this type of solutions is that in the last 50, 60, 70 years, big swaths of land have been converted into tree monocultures that they were selected to increase productivity for serving different industries like paper industry, timber, whatever has to do with biomass. But now we live in the era that we have understood the impacts of human activity over the years. So we are trying to restore all those ecosystems and bring them back to their former biodiverse, resilient, natural condition or close to nature condition. And today we are joined by Garreth, who is a protected areas manager at WWF Germany. Of course, we all know the WWF as one of the most influential environmental organizations globally, which is dedicated to nature conservation, protection of habitats and biodiversity, reducing the impacts of human activity on the natural world. And of course, we know of the iconic work that they have been doing over the years to protect endangered species like the giant panda, tigers, elephants, rhinos, marine turtles, among many, many others. But of course, they have programs and entire campaigns that focus on climate change, on pollution, on unsustainable production and consumption patterns, and certainly about deforestation. And this is what we are going to be talking today with Garreth, who has a master's degree in agroecology obtained at the Wageningen University in the Netherlands and France, with a thesis focusing on entomology. His first experiences with nature conservation was supporting a spatial survey of tiger populations with the Freeland Foundation in Thailand. This is something that we shared. Garreth, I also spent a few years doing research in the mountain forests of northern Thailand. So I would be really excited to learn about that project at some point as well. And he joined the WWF Germany 2.5 years ago and now focuses on forest and ecosystem restoration. So without much detail, I'm going to share today's slides. I'm going to do a very brief introduction about what the problem is before passing to passing the torch to Garreth. I hope you all can see my shared screen. Yeah. So old growth forests of the future. So the main problematic is here monocultures and how we can turn them into old growth, into diverse forests that will become the old growth forests of the future. So what is an old growth forest? Old growth forests have to do, of course, one defining factor is age. They are generally considered to be at least 120 years old, but some of them, in some cases, can be several centuries old. Biodiversity, the degree of biodiversity in old growth forests is very, very high. They provide habitat to numerous wild plants and animals, many of which are endangered or threatened. And they usually characterized by a multiple layers of trees and vegetation. So the canopy structure is much more complex than monocultures. And those older trees provide important habitat for wildlife, bird species, other plants that grow on the trees, little animals, that climb up them and have like are nesting, all kinds, insects, of course, all kinds of organisms can inhabit those old growth forests. But of course, as the trees die out, the standing snags and falling logs are also contributing to nutrient cycling, forming new soil, and providing, again, important habitat for microorganisms and insects and so on. And as an old growth forest, we would usually consider a forest that has minimal human disturbance, that is not exposed to large scale logging or intensive land use. And the forest ecosystems are generally not disrupted. So what are forest monocultures? What we usually see out there when we drive through a wooded land or when we pass by the train through what looks like a forest, most of the times it is a plantation, it is a forest monoculture. And in many times it's nothing more than a green desert, because it might look green, there might be thousands and millions of trees, but this is an intensive and uniform system. It does not have the diversity of species that, that define a forest. Take a look at the two slides, the two photos on the left panel of this slide. Above, we see a biodiverse forest, which has at least 8 to 10 different tree species. And then below, we have like a single tree plantation, which is a monoculture. So a monoculture is uniform in structure and composition, with a single tree species dominating the landscape. And this simplicity is also reflected in ecological functions. So if we have a single tree species, then we have a very narrow range of organisms that get habitat and services from this species. And those trees are usually selected for fast growth and high yields of timber or other industrial products. And these are intensively managed lands. They are nothing close to natural processes of nutrient cycling and so on. We have heavy use of fertilizers, pesticides, or other chemicals that are sprayed even by airplanes above those tree plantations to maintain productivity and prevent pest outbreaks. And they are generally vulnerable to pests and diseases because they are monocultures. They lacking the natural and genetic resilience that comes from biodiversity. Long story made short, if one tree is infected by a disease or a pest, then it usually and very often, very easily spreads to the next tree and then to the next tree because they are all clones of the same species. And here, like, just to give you a small example of why this is a problem, because we now also, due to climate change, we have big outbreaks of pests and diseases. And the most important here are the ones I'm showing you here, like this tiny European spruce beetle that is killing Europe's forests right now. A significant pest of spruce, especially Norwegian spruce. The larvae, the small eggs, insects that just hatch out of the egg, feed on the inner bark of the tree, which is the vital tissue that transfers water and nutrients throughout the tree. And if one tree is attacked, this infestation can easily spread to large areas. And this leads to significant forest loss, but obviously also to significant economic loss. And Germany is actually now suffering from this type of attacks in many, many places. And we see entire forest areas being decimated. And then forest managers need to go there, cut large areas of trees and rehabilitate this land. Another important pest disease is root rot, which is a fungus that infects the roots, causing root rot, which spreads very quickly through the root system, the stem, the trunk of the tree. And this reduces the growth and vigor of the trees. It weakens the trees, making them more susceptible to other pests and environmental stresses. And overall, forests lose their productivity and their ecosystem services. So let's keep all this as a background about the the dualism between old growth forests and the more recent monocultural forests. And let's dive into this approach into landscape conservation, forest conservation, that wants to restore monocultures with more diverse broadleaf trees to restore those ecosystems. And we have no better person to talk to us about this than Garreth, to whom I'm passing the torch right now. I'm going to stop sharing just for a second to give Garreth a chance to say hello before I continue with the slides.
Hello. Hi, thanks very much for the really nice introduction. I'm really happy to be here to be able to present our work with our valuable partner GamesForest.Club, who've been working with for I think over a year now. And yeah, I'm really excited to be able to present our work and tell you a bit more what WWF also does on a local level, not only with the landmark kind of keystone species in the tropics and all that kind of stuff, but also be able to present what we do on a local German level, which is not always very present in people's minds, that we always also work on that level, not only internationally in these famous biodiversity hotspots.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Garreth. I'm sharing the screen once more, so we can get started. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. So some of this first slide Pavlos has already mentioned, so I'll just skim through that a bit. Strictly speaking, old growth forests are forests that have never been managed. That is technically not possible in Germany, especially because Germany is a country where forestry has a long-standing tradition. So no such forest actually exists, as it doesn't in most of Western Europe. So we're for that reason, we try to be a bit more flexible on the term. A few examples that we still have of real old growth are, for example, in the east of Poland and Białowieża, and the Carpathian mountain range. So especially in Ukraine, but also in Romania, we have some beautiful pieces of old growth forests remaining. So if we wanted to recreate these structures, we would have to calculate at least 200 to 300 years of no management to create some kind of structure that is similar to old growth, even though real primeval forest is on many sites not possible anymore. Next slide, please. So why are old growth forests important? Well, a lot of species that they specialize actually on these on the decay of forest. And the problem is that with commercial forestry, that trees are always harvested at a point in time before it actually gets interesting for biodiversity. So apart from the fact that mainly monocultures are planted, trees are generally harvested between when they're 70 to 100. And for it to get really interesting for biodiversity, where woodpeckers have made their holes and other species move in, and kind of these natural structures evolve, the trees are harvested before that, and no dead wood is left in the forest. But this dead wood, it actually provides a lot of habitat for many species, and these species for that reason are endangered. Two examples for that are, for example, the western barbastelle bat. I think looks kind of cute. Some think it looks a bit ugly, but it's a fairly small bat, and it specializes on nesting in trees. So usually in monocultures, you can imagine there's no holes in the trees, there's no twisted branches or anything like that, so there's nowhere for them to nest. So they are endangered, just as the hermit beetle, which is a very specific beetle for like forests with a lot of dead wood, because they also live in former woodpecker holes, nesting holes, where they can live for many, many years, and they're called a hermit beetle because they always stay inside that inside that hole. So they will have their larvae feeding on the decaying matter inside the hole, and the only time they ever leave their hole is to mate. And they will only leave their hole with a radius of like a couple of 100 meters, meaning that they all kinds of destruction of the landscape leads to the fact that they can't multiply and diversify, because there's no dead wood for them to reach other holes where other hermit beetles are. So these are just two examples for species that specialize on this kind of structure. Next slide, please. So for a general picture, Pablo has already mentioned, how are the forests doing in Germany? Well, they're not doing very well. It's one thing I can tell you for sure. Like, a lot of people will have heard or seen the forest fires that have been raging through eastern Germany, and many parts, especially where we focus on in our work in eastern Germany. For many sites, it's not the question of whether which forest will be there, but if there will be forest at all. And that sounds drastic, but it is drastic, and it's a very serious situation. And if no drastic measures are taken now, and the way we manage the land isn't changed, then a lot of the areas where we had forest will not be able to have forest anymore. To name some figures, 500,000 hectares of forest in Germany have to be reforested due to the drought in 2018 to 2022. This in the middle, you see a picture of the Harz region, which used to be a very famous place to go hiking, one of the cultural centers in Germany, with a lot of old mining, and a lot of people used to go there on holidays, but it's not very attractive anymore because the whole region's forests have basically died. And recent studies have shown that only 20% of trees in Germany are fully healthy. And that is because of the heavy droughts that we've had. And as a result of the heavy droughts, the trees were weakened, and pest species like the spruce beetle can spread like wildfire through these trees. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what do we do to raise awareness of this and maybe show other alternatives to how sites can be managed and how nature can be protected in forests? We have a small project I work for, where we manage 4,500 hectares of conservation sites. That's fairly small, but these projects are meant as kind of lighthouse sites to demonstrate what can be done, how can we preserve these natural structures, and how can we let nature be nature again. 2,500 of the 2,500 hectares of the sites that we manage and own are forests. The rest are lakes and moorlands, and we also have some extensively managed grassland, all of which are very important for biodiversity. And a mixture of these habitats is what's crucial to preserve all kinds of species that specialize on different habitats. And the two sites I'm going to talk about now, next slide, please, are in the Uckermark. That's north. It's like 2 hours driving north of Berlin. It's a region that's famous for its lakes. It's also a region that's famous for its forests. And it's arguably one of the nicest regions in Germany, because it is very remote. There are not a lot of people living there, and it's just beautiful with the mix of open landscapes, forests, and these huge lakes. So it is very striking, but it has the same problems that many other sites also have. So there we manage 2 sites. Next slide, please. On which we have an approach of natural rejuvenation. So what does that mean? We want trees to disperse their seeds naturally, or of course the animals that help disperse the seeds, such as the Eurasian blue jay. Why do we prefer this measure, which is of course slower, it's less efficient than, for example, planting? Because most forestries are now restructuring their forests because the whole country has basically realized that we're not going to get anywhere with these monocultures. So there's massive replanting going on. Why do we prefer this approach? Well, we prefer it because naturally rejuvenated forests, so trees that planted themselves or were planted through nature's help, are much more resilient against extreme weather events because they're perfectly adapted to the site. They're not seeded in one place and then transported to another place where it takes them years to adapt to the site. But from the get-go, they can adapt to that site. They're genetically more diverse because tree nurseries often they have like replicas of the same tree. So there'll be lots of replicas of the same tree in this forest if you take it from a forestry. Whereas in a naturally rejuvenated forest, there'll be individuals from all over the area that are planting themselves. Overall, it's also much cheaper to manage. Planting is incredibly expensive. Buying the plants, but especially the labor, is very expensive, and we're lacking labor in Germany, so there's not really enough people to do it either. And generally, it's better for biodiversity as such because we get stronger trees, we get a more colorful mixture of trees. So yeah, that's why we do this. Next slide, please. But there are of course problems with this approach. There's no doubt about it, and there's a reason why a lot of the forestries decide to plant instead of doing this. So generally, there's of course a social context to the whole landscape in Germany. Hunting is a huge tradition in Germany. It has been so for hundreds of years, but this has caused massive problems as well because wildlife, especially deer, was preferred because the hunters wanted to shoot nice deer and they wanted to shoot big male deer especially. And so these were fed, they were specifically bred, and at the same time, all of the animals, especially wolves, lynx, and bear, that would have naturally reduced the population of the deer, were decimated and completely exterminated from the landscape. So you have all these herbivores in the landscape, but the big carnivores that can actually hunt the herbivores are gone. So we humans are the last people who can regulate the animals in the landscape at this point. Also, there's a problem with the overall natural rejuvenation and the natural forest scheme. So if you have the natural decay in the forest, if you have dead wood in the forest, you also increase the fuel load, meaning the forest will burn better, which can be a problem if there is a massive failure of the forest, but generally we don't see it as critically. And the protection of the forest from herbivores is very difficult. So fencing is only feasible for small areas. The problem is, as you see here on the right, the deer eat the young trees. So in the first 5 years or so, the deer will come into the forest, they will eat all of the young trees, and once a tree has been eaten, especially at the top node, it will never grow into a big strong tree. So these populations need to be the deer top populations need to be reduced, and that is at the moment the biggest problem with the natural rejuvenation approach, because we have high deer populations. Next slide, please. So what do we do specifically to work on these issues? So I'm going to present two sites to you. Site one is Zevlina Heide, which are both in the Uckermark. It's a very interesting site because it's a former Soviet Union rocket defense site. The army was stationed there in the DDR, and after the wall fell and the DDR, well, came to not exist anymore, this site went into the hands of the government, and the government eventually in 2016 transferred the site to WWF. So we had a lot of these interesting bunkers and old military structures on there, and now manage over 800 hectares with lots of old beech trees and rare bat species and bird species. And our measures here are zero use strategy. We want to enable natural growth and decay processes, so not taking out trees that die. We cull deer. That's still one of the most important measures that has an actual impact on the site, culling the deer and then enabling young trees to actually grow up and not be eaten. And also environmental education is, of course, a vital factor for this. Next slide, please. Yeah, and these sites have been coming under increasing pressure. So that just shows how drastic the situation is at the moment. So these pictures that you see at the right, they're both from this site, Zevlina Heide. So you would think that, okay, it's a mixed broadleaf forest. There's oak trees in there. There's beech trees in there, and there's all kinds of other smaller species of broadleaf forests in there. But there is, of course, also still coniferous species. There's Douglas fir. There's Scots pine. There's spruce trees, and there were these little islands of these coniferous trees, and due to the drought, they all completely failed, and which led to these two pictures that you can see. These swathes of forest have just been knocked over, and in normal forestry, you would usually say, okay, these trees have been knocked over. We'll take out all the wood, and we will replant this site. But that is not our approach, because that would lead to several problems on these areas. Because clearing out all these trees would mean that, first of all, the soil dries out much quicker, and also it's easily accessible to all the deer, so they can freely graze. They can eat all the young trees that are coming up. And the advantage of this how it is now, with all the trees falling all over each other, is that we have protection of the young trees. The deer can't be bothered to go in there, because they're like humans. If it's too much work, they won't bother doing it. And so we have natural protection of the trees. The only problem is, of course, like if this ever burns, it will burn very well. So it's an experiment that we're currently doing, and we will see how it goes. Next slide, please. So here again, the two options. Option A, common practice in forestry: remove dead wood, replant, hope that it works, which there's also no guarantee under climate change that this option always works. And option B is to leave the wood where it is, restore the nutrient cycles, and enable the natural rejuvenation of the forest, and finally have a strong forest that comes back. Next slide, please. So site number 2 This is quite the contrast to the first site, Zevlina Heide, but it makes it even more interesting because this is a very typical Scots pine monoculture. And these kinds of forests you will see all over Eastern Germany. Scots pine is like the love of the German forester and has been so for many centuries, really, especially in this part of Germany. In the south, it's often more spruce trees, but in this part of northern and eastern Germany, it's definitely the Scots pine because, as you can see in the first picture on top, it grows nice and straight. It looks clean. It's easy to harvest, and as such, for forestry, it's a great tree. The problem with these forests have been already mentioned. It's a monoculture. If something goes wrong, it goes really wrong, and also it burns very well, especially under drought conditions. So our goal with this forest is to create an old growth forest of tomorrow. That is a very slow process. And it's quite different from the site that we have in Zevlina Heide, because these trees, they're actually the Scots pine trees that we have here, they're quite healthy. So if we just left them to be, the tops would close, the forest would be pretty dark, and the forest could be like that for another 50 years or 100 years or 200 years. We don't know. And nothing would happen biodiversity wise. It wouldn't be very interesting. And the only thing that would really make a big difference would be like an extreme event, like a drought and resulting attack by bark beetles or a fire. So how do we speed this process up? Well, we selectively remove trees and let light onto the forest floor. If there's light on the forest floor, then broadleaf forests, broadleaf trees will come naturally because there are jays in the forest that are planting all the acorns everywhere, especially for beech and oak. And if you just remove trees and control the light a bit, then the trees will come. So that's kind of the approach that we're following. It's a very slow process, and it's a very labor-intensive process. And apart from that, we also do small planting sites to increase the diversity, because if we only let nature do its thing, then we'll have oak and beech mainly on this site. But for biodiversity's sake, we also do small plantings of other species that are less like key species in the forest, but are very interesting for biodiversity, for example, birds. Next slide, please. So yeah, the difficulties of this are it's very long term, so it's not a matter of 5 years of management, it's more a matter of 100 years of management that we're looking at here to really see the big impact and really change this forest and what we want. What you see a lot is people like forestries especially, they just want a radical approach and they cut down too many trees, and then the forest floor dries out, and then grass grows, and once grass grows you have a big problem because the seeds don't reach the bottom of the soil anymore and the forest doesn't regenerate. So that's something we want to prevent. Next slide, please. So yeah, and the overarching goal for all of our sites is to create or to recreate the natural balance in nature, where we don't have to do this intensive management that we're doing, especially in the second site, and have a maximum benefit to nature and people. And one of the key tools for this is, of course, our helpers of nature that help us recreate this natural balance. And one of them can be seen in the video on one of our sites. So yeah, this is actual footage from the first site, Sevelina Heide, the wolf, and it is an absolute key to recreate this natural balance, because once we have established predators back on the site, we don't have to do as much culling of the deer, and over time we will have a natural balance restored. But we're far away from reaching that goal. It'll still need many decades of actually planning and an increase of acceptance for these predators. We also need other predators like the lynx to return, which is much more complicated than the wolf, because the wolf travels very far by itself. The lynx is not like that. So we still have some ways to go, but there's hope, and things are improving, and on some aspects at least. So yeah, next slide. And I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you very much, Gareth. I think you have gave us a glimpse about the complexity of trying to engage in such an activity of like restoring, a uniform system and bring all the complexity of the ecosystem back. It's usually much easier to reduce the diversity than bringing it back. And it looks like you try to solve one issue and then you open up another few challenges. I don't know if this rings some bells for people from the gaming industry, but it is like a real world problem that it is really important for big amounts of land, not only for nature and species as you have explained, but also for like, the socioeconomics around those forests, like industrial activity, economic activity, recreation, cultural value. There are people that their livelihood depends on those forests and entire communities. I have a couple of questions to kick off the discussion and simulate the juices. And one is, again, about the socioeconomics. And are there any tensions that need to be considered when designing or implementing such a project? Because if you have like an industrially used forest land, and then suddenly you come and remove this industrial activity and you want to have like, lots of dead wood inside and a few wolves running around, possibly nearby villages, or cattle farmers. Is there like some sort of tension that like needs to be considered? And I'm asking this particularly because we usually tend to focus into this carbon or biodiversity tunnel, which are, of course, immense challenges of our times. But we forget to see through the lens of a transition, that there are entire communities that need to redefine their ways of lives as they have been shaped over time.
Yeah, it's a very good question, because there are, of course, loads of tensions, and I could approach this from different aspects, but just from the forestry aspect as such. Forestry is a long-standing tradition in Germany, and there's also a lot of pride and culture around forestry, with hunting and all the rights and things that people do around hunting and forestry. And of course, if they see conservationists getting forests from the government, forests that have been managed over sometimes decades, centuries by one family, of course there's tensions there, and we have that with our sites as well. And they're often quite annoyed that these forests are not used anymore, because resources are scarce. They see their forestry as an important contributor to the economy, and often it's seen as a waste to let wood rot. For example, that's one of the biggest things that annoys the people that do conventional forestry. And it's very important to just stay in dialogue with these people as well, and also find a compromise, because of course not every forest can be taken completely out of use. That's not realistic. We need resources, and there are very good ways of managing a forest by extracting wood as well. There have been some very interesting sites in also in that region on the side of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, where actually these key species, these key deadwood species, have been found in commercial forestry sites because they were well managed. The forestry had a more ecological approach, and any trees that looked that had like little holes in them were left standing. And so they've been able to create high biodiversity in a commercial forestry. So there are middle ways to do this, but not, of course, not everyone wants to do this and not everyone agrees. So that's also something you have to accept. But there is it's possible to coexist also with these commercial wants and needs.
Mm-hmm. This is very interesting. And if this type of tensions exist in a country like Germany, which is a developed, a rich country, imagine projects happening in the global south, in developing countries, where the forests are actually a life source for entire communities, for food, for medicine, for fiber, construction material, anything, and just going there and fencing these people out doesn't really work in the long term. And speaking about the long term, because you spoke about the importance of a long-term approach, this is not about managing a forest for 2, 5, 10 years. It's more like into an horizon of decades. I would like to have a comment on you on the importance of sustaining funding for this type of projects. To put it simply, if funds don't come for a year or two, is there a problem? What does it mean practically to you to have like a robust and sustainable and reliable influx of funds to implement those projects?
Yeah, it's absolutely essential that we have regular funding, external funding in some way, because these projects, they cannot be subsidized by the government, for example. There are currently no project that subsidize that, so we need other partners to fund the projects. When some people think about this kind of restoring natural balances, etc., some people tend to think that you just don't have to do anything, that it just let the forest grow and everything's good, you just leave it alone and everything's fine. But we are living in a country that is highly regulated, so there's so many things that you have to watch out for example, clearing paths. That's one of the biggest cost factors in Germany, because we have to regularly check if all the paths are safe, that no branches can fall on people's heads, that they can't fall on cars, etc. The culling of the deer, we have to pay people for that. We don't do that ourselves. Our forestry manager does that, and he's out there every week hunting, and that also costs a lot of money. Then there's all the taxes we have, the property tax we have to pay on the sites, and there's a lot of little things that we have to pay without even having implemented any measures. So it's quite expensive to run these sites. So in the end, it was also a way of cutting costs for the government as well, because they were able to give us these valuable sites, which was okay for us, but it also reduced their cost of managing them. And that's just something you have to be aware of. When you have a site, it will always cost you money, and that's why funding is indispensable.
Thanks. This is really, really insightful and interesting, like helping us to understand what lies beneath, these iconic big projects and the day-to-day complexities of trying to do something good for the planet, for nature. that requires, juggling around lots of open challenges at any time. I want to give an opportunity to our participants to pose a question. I think we have like a few more minutes, 5 to 10 minutes until we wrap this session. And I think this webinar is turning out like really resourceful for also the people that will be watching this as a video afterwards. So if anyone wants to ask Garreth a question, please feel free. Yeah,
I have a question. Garreth, how did it change in the last decades, the type of forest management you're practicing in Germany? Is it more shifting into letting the nature leave alone these days, or what's the percentage, and how was it developing over time?
So specifically by WWF now?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So like we've been working on this kind of project since the 70s when we started in Schalsee. That's also northern Germany. That was the big first big project. And those days it was already like the goal to recreate natural processes. That has always been like a key goal of the work, to stop use and just to give space to nature, just to regenerate. And the urgency the only thing that has really changed is the urgency, really, because we've had the second site, Barsdorfe Forst, for nearly 20 years now, and have been taking a very slow approach. And the recent years have just shown that things need to be speeded up a bit, because the forests have been dying over the past years, and we cannot wait too long to start the measures and kick off this process of natural regeneration. And that's why we've also been investing heavily in the site in Barsdorfe Forst to take out trees, to let light into the forest, and just to give this kind of a kickstart. And otherwise, it's always been our goal to let nature be itself, and show nature and show people what nature can be like in Germany, because there are not many places in Germany left where you can experience nature as it would have been in Germany. And that's something that we want to be able to show at some point.
Thanks. Do we have any other questions?
I would also, oh no, please go ahead.
Yeah, let's give the floor to us.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. One question I have is, in these forests that have been basically wiped out by bark beetles, is there an opportunity to introduce some of these management techniques, like towards long-term old growth forests? And is that already being adopted? Or like, how are those management techniques changing, given that the forest has already been wiped out?
It's a very good question, actually. And there are some really interesting examples of this. If you look, for example, in the national park Bayerischer Wald, about 20 years ago, they had exactly the same that happened in all across Germany. All the trees were wiped out. It was mainly spruce, and they took, for those days, a very controversial approach with huge protest in the national park of not taking out the trees. And they've been very successful with that. And it's been kind of like a lighthouse project for many other projects following that, because it's been so successful, and the forest has really regenerated itself very nicely over the past 20 years. And it's amazing to see these old dead standing trees, and under it like lots of young trees growing up. And it shows that even for these sites that have this massive forest failure, that the natural rejuvenation process is a viable strategy to regenerate the forest. And for that reason, because this has been so successful, now also the national park in Harz is also following that strategy, which is great to see.
Thank you.
Thank you. Georg, you wanted to shoot another answer?
Yes, I would like to know if you do any research. What happens when the wolf is coming back as, you know, top of the food chain type of animal? Can you get rid of the hunters more then, or what's the?
Well, it's still quite difficult because the first of all, we have no control over the full landscape, and we only have control over these small sites, so we can hunt on our sites, but we cannot control what the neighbors are doing. So the neighbors may be like feeding deer, and they may even use like these substances to attract deer while we're hunting, and all that kind of business goes on when you have hunters out there. What the wolf does, it basically shifts the deer around. So sometimes that can have a positive effect on one site, but a negative effect on the other site, because the wolf will push all of the deer into that other site, and then the deer will eat that forest basically. So at the moment it's still complicated, but we think that on our site in Sevlina Heide that it is having a positive impact. But one of the negative impacts that we have been seeing is that the herds of deer are growing in size, because before, when there was no wolf, the deer could roam around as they wanted, but now they're feeling less safe, so they are flocking together. So you have these huge armies of deer, sometimes with 200, 300, 400 individuals, that can destroy a forest in a very small period of time. So depending on where they decide to settle, that can also still be a problem. And for these big these big herds of deers, it's still crucial to have hunters to break them up. And unfortunately, it's not foreseeable that we'll be able to fully stop hunting anytime soon. It's just the reality of what it is, and we'd also prefer it to be otherwise, but it's just not doable without hunting at the moment.
Thank you. And it is quite interesting because I live in Freiburg, which is, at the foothills of the Schwarzwald. And here there is like a big cultural landscape around cattle breeding. And then it was interesting to hear a few farmers a few months back when I visited the natural reserve. They were really, really cross about wolves. And me coming from a conservation culture and education, I was actually very, very compelled by their arguments, because they are the people that live there inside. So this just give us a slight glimpse of the types of changes in mindset and cultural, behavioral changes that we all need to go through, no matter if we are, a cow farmer or the consumer of this cow, and how this impacts the health of the forest, and how the health of the forest impacts the future of survival for our family or for the world. And this is exactly the type of problematic that the entire world goes through today. And I do believe that with sound argumentation and science, of course, the help of technology, we can do those small steps so we can pass the torch, not towards a generation that will receive a destroyed planet, but some sort of a hope that there is a future, no matter if it's an old growth or a new growth future. I think it's a good time for us to wrap this webinar. I want to thank everyone for joining us in our April webinar. There's going to be a webinar on May, which we will also announce in our social media channel. Do follow the GamesForest.Club on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter for updates, knowledge bites, updates from our community, celebrations of progress and achievements we are reaching with our partners on the ground working in the forests. Thanks very much to Garreth Kratz from WWF Germany for sharing his experience today from the ground. It has been really, really informative and really, really valuable. And we will be sharing this video, and we hope that you will be sharing those insights with your own networks. So goodbye, everyone.